Am I good to go, Sander?
Yeah, you go ahead.
All right then. Superb. Thank you so much for attending my session. Thank you so much for having me. We're going to build an empire with Power BI, and this is it's always interesting to talk about levels. We have level 100 for basic stuff and level above ward for the stuff that nobody understands. But what is a level really? This one is somewhere between 100 and 200 maybe. I was going to say 153.4, but who's counting? Some of you are going to know this, some of you might find new things. So this story, as do most of my stories, started with a phone call. I was asked to come out to a customer that had, let's just say, jumped in, both feet first, into self-service Power BI and self-service BI with Power BI. They have embraced the whole self-service stuff, i.e. anything goes, let's come play, the more the merrier. And now they wanted to discuss the state of the project. I thought I detected an undertone of desperation, so I prepared for the worst. It wasn't enough. I used to be a paramedic, and the first thing you do at a scene of an accident is what's known as triage. This is to quickly get a grasp of the work ahead and to start prioritizing patients. And that was pretty much what I had to do, because the issues in this case were legion, right? Their data sources were slow. Reports were hammering data sources. The quality was absolute crap. The security was nowhere to be found. A lot of work was endlessly repeated, and nobody certified or basically cared about the data at all. Something had to be done, stat, as this patient was pretty rapidly expiring. So how do you build an empire? You build an empire on control, on order, on structure, but you also build your empire on efficiency, on empowerment and simplicity. What I saw coming into my customer was none of that. It was the ugly aftermath of a rampant self-service BI project where control was nowhere to be found, structure was unheard of, and empowerment meant that anybody could do anything anytime they wanted to. That's not an empire, that's chaos. And that's why we're going to go through how to use Power BI to empower users to achieve more without chaos. We're going to go and look at the why, the what, and the how of Power BI data flows and data sets and how they actually stick together. And I'm going to hopefully manage to stick in some tips as we go along as well. My name is Alexander. I'm a principal solutions architect at Atea in Sweden. It is the best title I've ever had because nobody knows what I do. I used to say that I run all over the world, speak at conferences, I teach courses, I do a lot of consulting for Atea. Then the world ended. So I've been doing a lot of this, speaking, I was about to say speaking to myself, but speaking from home, teaching courses, doing sessions like this. But my primary skills lie inside of the data realm. So Power BI, SQL Server, data lake, analytics, that kind of stuff. I'm a data platform MVP. I'm a certified trainer. I have a podcast known as Knee Deep in Tech, and I did a Pluralsight course on Power BI, which was actually relevant for all of 2 weeks. And then Microsoft changed parts of Power BI. I am not all bitter. They changed it for the better, so I'm fine. I've been at this for 23 years. And yes, it's starting to be some more white in my beard these days. I'll take that. So how did we get here? Let's backtrack a bit to find some common ground to stand on, right? I'm going to give you a quick demo. Let's just say that we want to look at data from San Francisco. Let's grab a data set, in this case, San Francisco PD at 2016, just to make sure that we're on the same page. What if we wanted to look around? We can filter depending on the district. We can filter depending on the category of the crime, and we can see the number of crimes per month, per weekday, and over 24 hours. And if anyone could explain to me why the northern district of San Francisco is actually south of the southern district, I'm all ears, but that's an aside. So this is the base report that we're going to be toying with to explain the different concepts. And what did we actually do? Well, in this case, we started with the most dangerous piece of software ever devised, Excel. And we have our data source in an Excel file, in this case, a CSV file, comma separated file. Unfortunately, as most of you know, it's basically impossible to just take the data and visualize it. We're going to need to do some data wrangling. And this might be a lot of wrangling, or it might be much less wrangling. In this case, it's a fair amount of wrangling to make the data presentable. When we've done the wrangling, we show this to the consumer. And in this case, we do that through a visual with the Power BI. And with these steps, it's kind of important to look at who's doing what, because the people with the data source are, well, they may be the people doing the data wrangling, and they may be the consumer, but a lot of time the consumers are the business, and the business don't really care about and really don't know about how to do data stuff, which is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. So in this case, we are looking at data competencies, we are looking at Power Query or M competency, and we're looking at the DAX or the data analysis expressions of Power BI or Excel. What happens when I want to look at refresh data? 2016 data is not going to be refreshed tomorrow. It's going to be the same data tomorrow as it's going to be the next week. Don't go refreshing and hoping that it's going to change. But if this was data that is updated, when you click refresh inside of Power BI, what's going to happen? Well, Power BI is going to reach out to the data source and start pulling stuff through the data wrangling and into Power BI again. Let's look at the Power Query stuff that lies underneath this and what I basically did. So we are looking at the Power Query editor. And if we were to grab a new set of data, let's go for weather data. We have data for the weather in San Francisco. So let's see if we can actually correlate this and see if there's a correlation when it comes to weather. I'm going to choose a few of the columns. I'm going to remove a lot of them because I don't care about snow and that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, I'm also going to be removing TAVG or the temperature average because it's null. We have the precipitation, and precipitation in this case, it's going to be in text. And I'm going to change this to a number, and be very careful here because change type with locale is a good way of handling comma separated or decimal separated. Or yeah, I'm going to change the name to precipitation inch because that's what it is. And being a very metric oriented person from the Nordics, I like to have precipitation in millimeters as well. And that's going to be the inches times 25.4. Just something I know. Now we have those, we need to change the type again to make sure that it's a decimal number and not a text. And I'm moving it so it's side by side. Let's go for the Tmax. That's the temperature max. And since they are in Fahrenheit, I'm changing to Tmax and Tmin Fahrenheit. We need to add more columns. In this case, we're going to have a T average, again in Fahrenheit. And that's easy because it's going to be Tmax Fahrenheit plus Tmin Fahrenheit divided by 2. Having done that, let's again change the type to a decimal number. Now, I don't like imperial stuff. I want to have things in metric. So let's go for T average Celsius. And I'm not going to explain how it works. I just pasted in how to do it. And that's how you convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius. Again, we need to put it as a decimal number, give this whole data set a name, whether data is of 2016, and then we can actually start using it. So this is the data wrangling part of adding weather to this report. So how do we actually consume this data? Well, I'm very happy you asked. What if we were to put this into the number of crimes per month? So we add this data to an already existing visual. Well, let's look at how we do that. We open up the visuals and we go for the t-average Celsius and just drag that to the number of crimes per month. Unfortunately, that is not going to work very well with that visuals. We need to change it to a line and stacked column chart. Oops. Yeah, that didn't work quite as well either. So we're moving the number of crimes to the line values. Now we're starting to see something. It is t-average. Unfortunately, it's going to be automatically going for sum. So we change that to average. And then we give it a good name. But wait a second, it's all the same number. There's a reason for this. That reason is this. There is no connection between the new data set and the date table that we are using to slice and dice the data. So I need to create this connection just by dragging date to date. Then suddenly we can correlate these two tables. Voila, there we go. And now we can see that there is no big impact from the weather basically at all. But we add the name and average temperature for that visual. So there goes the idea that if we just make everything warm, it's going to be better, or if we just make everything cold, it's going to get worse. Come to the Nordic and I'll explain to you what cold means. Or you can go to the UK and find out all about rain. So what did we do? Well, we basically did the same thing as I showed you a few minutes ago. But in this case, we have upgraded our data source to 2 Excel sheets. And we're doing the same thing. We're pulling the data into Power Query, and then we're presenting the whole shebang to the user or the analyst or whatever there may be. And whenever I refresh my report, again, these are historical data, so I'm not going to be getting any new data, but the result is going to be the same. If I click refresh, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to reach out and grab the data from both our data sources. Just think of this for a second. What if we had 10 of them? Then we're starting to pull the data to the Power Query or the wrangling step, and then into Power BI Desktop or Power BI Service. This is starting to become an issue because, again, if we are doing this for 2, that's fine. If we're doing it for 500, we have an issue because what's going to happen is we add more and more and more of the same type. We're using the same base data. We're all creating our own transformations, our own data wrangling. We are all creating our own reports. And when people are starting to do refresh on these, well, go figure. It's going to start hammering the infrastructure like you would not believe. This is not a good solution to things. We have the original data set created from 2 data sources, and we have a lot of similar attempts. To just throw in another wrench into the works, what if everybody thinks that they're doing the same transformations? Let's just say that these are financial data. Everybody thinks they're doing the same transformations, but someone by mistake has moved a decimal point or done a calculation that is just not right. People don't know that. They all think that their data is the correct data. Danger, Will Robinson, danger. Wouldn't it be kind of fun or nice if there was just a tool for this? But there is. Let's introduce dataflows. The main reaction that I heard from my customers when I said data flows the first time was a resounding, huh? And it's kind of cool, because what did we do? We have the data in, again, Excel. We're doing some wrangling. That's going to be Power Query or M. But what if I told you that we could reuse this Power Query magic and store it somewhere where we can reuse that already done as a data source? Exactly. Say hello to Power BI data flows, because we're storing the result in a data lake. Now, you don't need to care about that data lake. You don't even need to know that it's there technically, because it's not going to do anything for you at this stage. It's just going to be a storage area for your Power Query, and that's it. And the data inside as well. So this means that instead of having my data sources that I need to do the query, that I need to do the Power Query on, I can just connect to this Power BI data flow as if it was a data source. Thus, I just abstracted away all the, depending on who you're asking, boring and difficult wrangling stuff. Me, I kind of like it, but yeah, that's me. And what's even more fun is, here we may have a certified data flow. This is deemed kosher by the IT department. This is the right way to do the transformations. Thus, we can have multiple reports based off that single data flow. Now we're cooking. This is a way of reusing, and reusing is always smart unless you're reusing crap, but yeah, nobody wants to do that. And there's another interesting phenomena that's going to happen here, because if I were to refresh my report, instead of going all the way to the source, I am going to go to the lake and pull the data from the lake. And if everybody else is doing their refreshes, they're also going to go to the lake and pull that data to the client. So this means we just introduced another level, an intermediate step, where we can refresh data and where we can pull data from the source. We're actually relieving the source from hammering, and we can control when the data source gets to put the data to the lake. But again, I'm going to do that once instead of once for every refresh of all the reports. So this is a huge win at this stage. And again, I need to be very, very clear. If you were to upload a data set into Power BI, you put it in the service. If you put stuff in a Power BI data flow, it's going to go into the data lake underneath Power BI service, right? Okay. Why are we doing this? Well, we are reducing the risk of deviating data, because again, we know exactly what steps we did. If we need to change anything, we can do it in one data flow and not try to figure out all the 142 data flows that the 142 Power Query data wrangling stuff that people have done. Because at the end of the day, no one really documents everything. You're always going to find this outlier that is kind of out there somewhere. We are increasing performance not only by, in some cases, if you want to do that, automatically aggregating inside the data lake, but we are lessening the impact for the source systems. And in a busy environment, that can be pretty huge. We're also making it so much easier to find data sources. One of the demos that I usually do is I take data from Statistics Sweden, a government agency that is tasked with statistics all over Sweden. They present their data in JSON format, and JSON is better than XML, but it's like saying that it's better to hit yourself in the head with a baseball bat than with a hammer. It's not fun. And going from JSON to usable data in Power BI, let's just say that it's a bit convoluted, right? And this is where Power BI data flows comes in its own. I can do all the weird stuff that I need to do to make my data much easier to work with and show that data flow to my users. And suddenly they don't need to care about the fact that it's a lot of weird steps behind. I tell them, here are the data sources that we use them, boom, everything just works. So let's go a bit deeper. Like the like in Lord of the Rings, the dwarves, they dug deep. We're not going to dig too deep because we're all going to be getting out of this in a few minutes as well. So how do we do this? How do we create a data flow? Well, there are a few ways, and we start here. This is where you create a data flow. And a data flow is really just the M code, the Power Query code that we did earlier, right? This is the code. This is the steps that we did to bring in the weather data. And you don't need to be able to read this. I just want to point out one thing, and that is the source. In this case, I am saying I want to read a file that's in C temp Power BI sfweather 2016.csv. That's going to be the source. And in this case, it's on my C drive. How will the Power BI service access my C drive? Is it going to ask nicely? Well, yeah, but doesn't matter. I need to put in what's known as the Power BI gateway. The gateway enables me to move data basically freely from my machine or my server or my on-prem environment to the Power BI service. And from that Power BI gateway, the Power BI data flows can access and refresh the data from my on-prem environment. Now, this is a good thing for databases and stuff, but if we're just talking about text files or CSV files or Excel sheets and that kind of stuff, there is an easier way, much easier way in my view, and that is putting things in OneDrive. Because OneDrive is automatically syncing your data to the cloud. And when the data is already in the cloud, well, I can use what's known as the Web API connector in Power BI to grab the data from OneDrive. The dirty secret of OneDrive, what is underneath OneDrive? Yes, it's SharePoint. And now you need to go and clean your ears with bleach. That's a bad thing, and that's a good thing. In this case, it's so easy to just grab the data from the SharePoint, and we don't need to figure out a Power BI gateway because we already have the gateway with OneDrive, right? And then I connect Power BI data flows to this Web API connector, which in turn goes to OneDrive to grab your data that you pulled in with Excel. What's also a nice feature of this is that it's instantly updated. So whenever I save something in Excel to OneDrive, OneDrive instantly syncs it and boom, it's available the next time I refresh my Power BI data flow. So how do we do this? Let's look at a demo. I already have a data flow with the base data. I want to add the data flow. I want to add a data flow to grab the weather data. So what we need to do is to create a new data flow. And here we have a few options. We're going to go for define a new entity in this case. And we need to scroll down so we can find the Web API. There we go. And the Web API is going to take a URL. I'm just going to paste in my URL. That's the URL for the CSV file inside of the OneDrive SharePoint thingy. I've already logged in, so it's not going to ask me for that. And go next, and it's going to go out and pull that file in. Nothing has been done to the file. This is the pristine way that it looks like. Here we have the M code. What if I just took all this code, removed it, kept the source, and pasted in the things we already had done? Will this work, you think? Let's try. Yes, it did. Now, this doesn't always work. For most of the transformations, this is going to work perfectly fine. For all of them, no. Then I go to save the query. It does a validation. Is it still a kosher query? Yes. And now I say what the data flow is called. Weather data SF 2016. I'm going to save it. It's going to ask me, do you want to refresh now, or should I set a refresh schedule? If you don't do a refresh now, the only thing that the Power BI data flow is containing is nothing. We only have the definition in the M code, but unless we actually do a refresh, there's not going to be any data inside of the Power BI data flow as well. So what we basically did was we took this and we pretty much just changed the first line. I could have just put in this manually, but I wanted to show you the steps on how I got here. But it's basically just a wrapper around a URL. Easy peasy. So what happens now is whenever I refresh my data lake, in this case a Power BI data flow, it's going to go out and pull the data from my source through my transformations and boom into the lake. Inside of this lake is a structure of directories known as the common data, I just lost the word, a common data model, CDM. That's just the structure of the data. So underneath all this becomes text files. What if I told you that we could do some pretty nifty things inside of the data lake? Take, for instance, when you duplicate entities in Power BI desktop and you link them together and all that kind of funky stuff. We could reference and we can do aggregations inside of the lake, again, removing the workload from the service or the sources. There is a caveat here though. This is premium territory. In order to do computed entities or linked entities, you need premium capacity. Now, that does not mean that you need a P SKU. You can do this with an A4 SKU just as well as you can do with a P SKU or an EM SKU. There are ways. Just Google it and go find out. So, summarizing Power BI data flows, it's almost the same Power Query. Again, it's so close to the Power Query that you wrote in or had written for you in Power BI desktop. Some things might need to be tweaked, some things might not work. You need to test it and figure out what works for you. But for the most part, it's the same Power Query, so you don't need to learn something new. Some features require premium, and that would be the computed entities or linked entities. But maybe you don't need them. Don't let anybody tell you that you need premium to run Power BI data flows, because that's just not true. Do consider refresh. Definitely do consider refresh, because unless you do a refresh, your data is not going to be available in the data flow, right? And it doesn't matter if you do a refresh 10 times a day and your base data doesn't change, and vice versa. So you need to figure out how much to refresh, when to refresh, and so on and so forth. What if we keep going beyond the data flows? Because there are a few things that are not in the data flows. Remember this one? So on the top picture, we see the same numbers. We're not seeing any changes in temperature, right? And in the other one, we have the numbers. You remember why this was? Yeah, it was because we did not have a connection between the date table and the weather data. Why do I have a separate date table? I didn't tell you earlier. Well, it means that I can slice and dice the data in ways that I can't do if I just have a date. I don't know from one date which quarter it is, but the date table knows that this date is in this quarter, and thus I can slice from that quarter. In this case, I don't have quarters, but I have day of week, I have day of week number, and day of week short, and so on and so forth. I can easily expand my date table. I also have a time table. This is to be able to aggregate crimes in 15-minute chunks, if you will, and not only look at crime over 1 hour or a day time span. So by creating this connection between the dates, now we have a connection between date, date, and date, and I can work with all these. Is this part of the data flow? No, it isn't. This is part of the data set. And if we look at what I actually did, or what I basically based the entire report on, it's just one measure. That measure is number of crimes, and that is a count. That's the underpinnings of the entire report. Is that part of the data flow? No, because that's in the data set. Okay. So we can base multiple reports off one data flow. We could say that we can base multiple data sets on one data flow. We can also have multiple reports off of one data set. Now it becomes pretty darn interesting because we are now separating duties. I'm going to show you in a second. This is what it looks like if you combine everything into one thing. We have the data sources going into Power Query, being stored as a data flow in a data lake. Data sets are based off a data flow, and then we have one or more reports based off this data set. This means that we can do different things with different people. We can have a separation of duty. And what's even more fun is we can actually do an endorsement, both on the data flows, the data sets, and we just got this for the data flows as well. Now, dirty little secret, what does endorsement mean? What does it mean when I certify a data set? It means nothing. Absolutely nothing. It just means that I, as Alexander, the Swedish guy, says, I certify this data set. This data set is the best data set ever. If you trust me, well, good. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter. There's no technical steps involved. So you need to figure out a way of certifying. Let's backtrack. You need to figure out what a process. So the certification or the promotion in this case means something. But this is a great way to have your data flows and data sets done by IT or by the analysts, and have that certified and promoted as the go-to data source whenever someone else wants to play with this. So we are taking, again, we have the data flows. That's going to be the data wrangling part. So this is where you have most of the people that do Power Query. Then we bring this into the data set where we create measures and add in relations and basically do the whole data modeling part of things. This is primarily going to be DAX, data analysis expressions. There we go. And then we hand over to the reports people. This is three different skill sets, because we have the engineers, the data engineers, we have the business analysts, and then we have the visual communicators. Most people are going to do this the whole thing on their own, boom. But there are three very different skill sets. And I would argue that while most people think that BI is all about the reporting stuff. It's extremely important, but let's just say that if your data is crap or your data model is crap, your visuals are probably going to be pretty crap too. So how do you move forward? Well, there are a few steps we can take from here. Remember this guy, the data lake. Yeah, I told you, you don't need to care about this. And that's all well and true. There's also something in teaching called lies to children. And this is where you, for instance, tell them that something in a specific way, but in reality, it isn't. But they need to get older before they understand. So what do we do with this data lake? Just using Power BI data flows is going to give you a data lake. It's going to be underneath this. You don't need to touch it. The good thing is you don't need to do anything with it. It's going to sort itself. It's going to work perfectly. The flip side of that is you can't access any data from that data lake. And let's think about that for a second. Why would you want to do that? Well, there are a few reasons. Because suddenly you can use Power Query to pre-process data for consumption in a third-party tool that is not Power BI. That's pretty cool. You could also create data flows by some third-party tool without using Power Query, because what is a data flow? It is a JSON script, basically a JSON definition and some data. That's all there is to it. How do you get access to the data? Well, you need to put in your own data lake. And that is very easy. You just say, instead of using the built-in Power BI data lake, you go for your own organizational data lake. Word of warning. Unless something has changed very recently, this is a one-way operation. You cannot do this as a test run and then go back to the Power BI data lake. Ask me how I know. Just saying. So we can also look at this from a more process-oriented standpoint. We could put all our data flows in a separate workspace, or we can have multiple workspaces, but we are putting the data flow stuff in its own workspace. That also means that we are separating out data flows from reports, just like we could have data sets in one and reports and dashboards in another. So this is, again, a separation of duties. Keep in mind that this is going to be a bit funky with privileges, but it's doable. It's well documented, but it's also, in my view, a good practice to have order of things. If you start to put everything in the same box, well, there's a huge risk that you're going to end up with the same kind of disaster that will befall you if you open one of my drawers in my office. Just don't. It's a mess. It works, but it's a mess. Don't have a mess. Which also brings us to implementing a data catalog, because it's all good and well to have access to all this data, especially if we're talking a data lake where you generally find yourself having a ton of data. But it doesn't matter if nobody knows where it is. It doesn't matter if nobody knows what it is. A data catalog is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a catalog of what data you have, how was it pulled in, has anything been done to it, when was it pulled in, where is it stored, what is the format, and so on and so forth. It's basically a manual for your data. And very, very few of my customers, A, knows what a data catalog is, and by extension don't have one, and B, knows that there is a service for it. Azure Data Catalog is a thing. Version 1 was an absolute disaster. Version 2 is better. It has a long way to go, but there are third-party tools available, but use the data catalog. make sure that you know where your data is at any given point in time. And of course, while we're at it, go establish a data culture. What the heck is a data culture? Well, a data culture is where everybody has a stake in the data. Everything means something to someone. This is a culture where it is obvious to document your data. It's obvious and it's ingrained that we behave in a certain way around data. We have security, we have sharing to the right people, and so on and so forth. The data culture is the umbrella, if you will, that you create your good Power BI empire on. Because without a good data culture, a pervasive data culture that goes through all the levels, from the higher ups all the way down to the people that actually do the work. If you don't have a good culture, nothing's going to work. Look at the most successful companies. Why do you want to work for Apple? It's not because they have the best of everything. The culture is the thing. Why do you want to work for Microsoft? The culture is the thing. And take that mindset and apply it to data, because data is so darn important. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that order is absolutely necessary. To use German, Ordnung muss sein. You just need order. If you don't have order, you have nothing to work with. Reuse will increase efficiency, and that means that you can use that power somewhere else. You only have so much money and so many people. Make sure that you use that power to where it can do the most damage, if you will. And a step to creating the data culture is empowerment. And do pause a bit and think about what empowerment means. It does not mean giving everybody and their cats all the privileges ever. That's not empowerment, that's chaos. Empowerment means giving people enough power to do what they need, and be also on the lookout and listen if they're asking for more. That's what empowerment means. And this also means that you're putting not only empowerment, i.e. power, you're also putting trust in your users. And people who feel they're trusted tend to do better work and have a stake in the whole conversation. So in closing, stop trying to eat the whole elephant in one go. Can't do it, doesn't work, and you will inevitably cause indigestion. So instead, use the tools and the people available to work smarter, enlist the business, and have a clear why as your guiding star. Why are you doing this? Is this something that will benefit my business? Yes, let's do it. No, let's not do it. Use these and let's go build an empire with Power BI. Thank you so much. My name is Alexander, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Alex. So, Alexander, we have a few questions.
Uh-oh.
Well, the first one is, can we use ADF/SSIS instead of dataflow?
Oh, that's a great question. So the linchpin of that one is instead of. It depends on what you want to use the data flow for. Could you use ADF or SSIS to create the data and expose it as a data flow? Yes, and thus you can use Power BI connected to a data flow instead of doing it through Power Query. But I'm not quite sure what the use case for the question was.
It doesn't say. It's just that part of the question. Maybe.
So my answer is a resounding yes, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is, can dataflow also be used on reporting services server?
No. And that was a good question as well. I really need to put that into my slide deck, because data flows are the sole domain of the service, i.e. powerbi.com, and you cannot use data flows in the report server.
Okay. And then the last question. If you had the option, would you create a data warehouse or just use data flows?
Oh, that's a fun one. It's not unlike pulling the pin from a grenade and running. So the answer to that one is yes and no and maybe. You can do it in so many ways. And what's even worse is they don't need to be mutually exclusive. I would argue, and this is what I tell my customers, it is extremely difficult to implement a data warehousing solution. In my view, most of the data warehousing projects are going to go on forever. They're going to be extremely expensive and ultimately not deliver what you thought they would. So that's why I recommend a iterative step-by-step approach. And this is where you combine them. So you start with the data, start with an analyst doing something in Power Query. You pull that into a data flow, more people can build the data set on it and work with it and realize that, yes, this is a way to go. And when you have that kind of already ironed out the bugs, then you're looking at taking that and pulling it into a real data warehouse. And then you do the whole thing again. So that's how you combine them all for maximum benefit.
I think we have time for another question, just came in. So what's the advantage of the data flow?
As compared to what?
Yeah, compared to what?
No, so the main advantage for me is reuse, because it reuse and decoupling. Reuse when it comes to reusing complex M code, and decoupling in that I might have someone that is absolutely expert on creating data models, but they don't know the first thing about Power Query. So in this case, I can just have two people work on the same project and not having to have all that knowledge in the same person.
Okay. Those were the questions. Thank you very much for presenting your session.